The sixth plague, boils. The Egyptians had several medical gods, and they sacrificed humans to these gods, burning them alive on a high altar and scattering their ashes into the air. It was believed that with every scattered ash, a blessing would descend upon the people. So, Moses and Aaron took the ashes from the furnace and scattered them into the air, but now everyone the ashes touched broke out with boils. The God of Moses seems to overpower the Egyptian god of medicine, intelligence, and wisdom. The seventh plague, hail. During this destructive storm, the God of Moses seems to overpower Egyptian gods such as the sky goddess and the protector of crops. The hail attacked the fields during the time of harvest, destroying all the crops. Nut was blamed, and Seth could not protect the crops like he was supposed to. The eighth plague, locusts. Whatever wasn't destroyed by the hail was finished off by the locusts. Locusts were so feared that the Egyptians actually had a god to protect them from the vile insects. The God of Moses seems to overpower the Egyptian gods, such as the god of the fields and the protector against locusts. When this happened, Isis was shamed and Anubis was overcome. The ninth plague, darkness. With darkness so intense you could feel it, the God of Moses seems to overpower the Egyptian god of the sun. After 3 days of complete darkness, the Egyptian feared Ra, the sun god, was dead. The 10th plague, death of the firstborns. Pharaoh was considered a god, and his firstborn son was too. In fact, firstborn people and animals were often worshipped. Pharaoh was considered an incarnation of Ra, the sun god. Because Pharaoh's son was considered a god, and Pharaoh's firstborn son did die during this plague, a god of Egypt actually died. So, the God of Moses seems to overpower the Egyptian god of the Pharaoh's son. The first plague, water turned into blood. The most common scientific explanation has been that it was a product of algae or silt in the river. In the spring of 1997, a new environmental disaster was causing fish to die and waterways to turn red in North Carolina in the United States. Turns out an algae called Pfiesteria was the identified organism responsible. It could be possible that the first plague was really a toxic freshwater algae. The second plague, frogs. A mass death of fish would have freed the frog spawn from its most important predator, so that unusually large numbers of frogs would have developed into maturity. In turn, these frogs would have been forced away from the toxic river, migrating in great numbers to the land. Furthermore, it's been studied that the bufo toads can produce hundreds of thousands of eggs from a single individual, and that it is possible that the bufo toads could have been the frogs of the second plague. The third plague, lice or gnats. After tons of frogs dying, it's no surprise that a massive upsurge in the insect population occurred. Technically, these lice could have been scabies, ticks, maggots, black flies, mosquitoes, or midges/gnats. However, most experts agree that midges, also known as gnats and sandflies, are most likely the lice mentioned in Plague 3. They're blood-sucking flies that can emerge in huge numbers and might indeed be seen as the plague arising from the dust of the land. Recent researchers also have evidence that these insects have been associated with both human and animal viral diseases. The fourth plague, flies. Once again, the large amount of dead frogs could have led to this second increase in the insect population. After looking at many different kinds of flies, the most probable candidate for the fourth plague seems to be the stable fly. Its bites often leave open puncture wounds, exposing the victim to secondary infections, and these flies have been known to increase in population rapidly and live in dry, arid conditions. The fifth plague, pestilence. This plague was hard to identify because of the illness described. There are many diseases that could kill animals, but nearly all the diseases proposed did not affect or spread the way the plague did in Scripture. Finally, 2 viral viruses seemed to fit the bill. African horse sickness, which obviously affects animals like horses, donkeys, and mules, and a closely related virus, blue tongue, which affects cattle, sheep, and goats in a similar way. These two viruses also make sense because both can be spread by the type of midge chosen for Plague 3. The sixth plague, boils. Although many scientific explanations have been proposed, like anthrax and a combined bacterial infection that result in a plague like the one in the Bible, some researchers have proposed that Pseudomonas mali is the disease of the sixth plague. It's a bacterium responsible for glanders, a highly contagious infection which can be spread in the air by direct contact or through fly bites. It fits the description of a plague of boils and blains extremely well, and its most likely carrier would have been the stable fly. The seventh plague, hail. Hail can occur almost anywhere in the world, although storms of such ferocity tend to be associated with hotter regions. Even the smallest stones can cause great damage to crops and vegetation, and showers of larger ones can cause severe damage to mud brick buildings and kill or seriously injure animals or humans caught out in the open. One such violent hailstorm took place in Israel and Jordan in October 1997. The eighth plague, locusts. The most probable culprit for this plague is the desert locust. It is known to cause serious damage to crops and other vegetation when it swarms, and it appears in ancient Egypt during various frenzies predating the time of the plagues. It's relatively harmless in its solitary phase, when its population is low, but then becomes highly destructive in its gregarious phase, when it swarms in huge numbers. These swarms fly by day in warm weather, descending in vast hordes to consume all living vegetation in the areas they afflict. The ninth plague, darkness. A few different ideas have been proposed for this plague, but many have agreed that this darkness was produced by a hot wind sweeping in from the Sahara. This wind can produce fierce sandstorms during its season and from March to May, and can last for 2 to 3 days, such as the one that struck Cairo in the spring of 1997. These sandstorms could also cover entire buildings in a fine sand and blot out the sun with a dark, dusty haze. The 10th plague, death of the firstborns. While many illnesses and natural disasters have tried to explain the final plague, none of them could explain how only the firstborn among the Egyptians and animals were killed, or how they were killed in only one night. The most likely theory to date is that a deadly mycotoxin was carried on the fungal spores of the damp and quickly stored food after the hailstorm of Plague 7 and the locusts of Plague 8. With most of the recovered food having this deadly mycotoxin in it, anyone who ate it would have suffered the almost immediate death of mycotoxin poisoning. How does this make sense if only the firstborns die? In Egyptian culture, the most dominant animals and human beings would have had the first access to the stored food supplies, and so they would have been the most affected by the fatal toxins. Deeper store grains and foodstuffs may not have been so affected by the surface-growing mold, possibly sparing humans and animals who fed off it later. In the book of Exodus, the 10 plagues are of huge significance to the Hebrew slaves. It shows the Hebrew slaves that their God was there for them, and was finally answering their prayers of rescue from the Egyptians oppressing them. In the Old Testament, the 10 plagues are important because without them, the Hebrew slaves may have never escaped Egypt, or obtained the 10 Commandments. The Exodus became for the Hebrews the supreme occasion when God acted to deliver his people from harsh captivity, binding them to himself by a solemn covenant. In Exodus, the God of Moses institutes the Mosaic covenant, which was centered around God's giving his divine law to Moses on Mount Sinai. Even today, when the Jews celebrate Passover, they are reminded of God's mighty deliverance in that long ago time. In the context of the entire Bible, the 10 plagues are also important. Whether you're looking at the Old Testament with religious significance to your religion, or if you just see it as just an interesting collection of books, Exodus and the 10 Plagues seeks to tell its readers about the extraordinary powers and protection of the God of Moses. and further adds to the many scripture verses and stories in the Bible when its text encourages the idea that if followers of the God of Moses put their trust in God and do his will, they will be blessed. When followers of the God of Moses fail to obey God, they will suffer the consequences.